Hello again, everybody, and welcome to Fractured Realities. I am your host, Jay Warner. Being that it is October, the fall season, and Halloween's just right around the corner, I figured that I would share one of my more profound ghost type encounters or supernatural encounters. Now, I have had a couple of my friends and family, when I posted this on Facebook and mentioned it, say that I should mention this and I should mention that. So definitely got to do a couple shout outs here, and I'll kind of get to them slowly. But the one that I want to talk mainly, I'm gonna tell a couple stories, but the one that I want to talk mainly about is one that happened to me when I was 7 years old. And this is when I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that ghosts were real. That this wasn't just something that was a product of my imagination. So it's kind of a long story, but hopefully you could sit here and bear with me. Now, let me do a little background. I always say this, I know. Let me do a little background and explain to you, kind of where I lived and the neighborhood, so you could get kind of a setup. It was, the lower west side of Cleveland. If any of you have ever seen A Christmas Story about the kid with the BB gun, that was probably maybe about a mile away from where I live. So it was a similar type neighborhood. When I was a little kid, it was basically lower middle class, blue collar type area. Most of the people on my street were actually homeowners, including my parents. But, it's definitely not that anymore, but, urban development. Anyway. So the house that I grew up in, there was a small brown house right next door to my house. And my house was like the only house on the street that sat back, like all the way to the back of the lot. My backyard consisted of 4 foot and then a fence, where all the other houses were front facing in the street and they had, the backyards. But, for some reason, my parents decided to pick the oddball. But anyway, it was a very strange old house. Had a real small, creepy, damp, nasty basement, and a second story and a third story, about 3 to 4 bedrooms depending on it. And it was always a weird house. When I grew up, there was one time, and I wasn't personally there for this, and I'm glad I wasn't, because it would have freaked me out and caused me to have even more sleep problems than I already had there. But I guess apparently a lady walked through the front door and didn't say a word and walked upstairs. See, this was verified too by my father, who was very much an agnostic, didn't believe in the supernatural, or so he led us on to believe. Later on, I found out that he had a few more beliefs than he let on, but he just didn't, want to scare us. He wanted to convince us that it was all, bullshit, manifested, horror movie, hoopla. But anyway, so apparently one time my parents were sitting in the living room, and one of my older brothers were there. I can't remember which one, but lady just walks in and walked upstairs. So, immediately my parents went upstairs to find her, and just, there's only one staircase, one entrance in and out. And all the windows were closed. She didn't jump through a window, but she just literally zapped out. And it's just little weird things like that. You'd hear knocks on the door on the door in the middle of the night. Nobody would be there. Toilets would flush on their own. And as my nephew Randy pointed out to me, one thing that was really prevalent when I was a little kid, and I guess apparently when he was a kid too, later on in the house, he spent a lot of time there as a child, or the red orbs. Literally, you would just be sitting there, and just these red orbs would float by you. I mean, it just became a normal thing for me. I never thought anything of it. I'm like, yeah, it's, shit playing tricks. But every once in a while, when one of these red orbs would move into you, it was like, standing in front of an air conditioner on blast. It just chilled you to the bone. Or gave you little shivers of these little tingly feelings through your body. And it was really, really odd. But yeah, Randy mentioned that to me, so I definitely want to mention that. And I love you, Randy. And I hope you're watching this. And I appreciate that, Jay. But yeah, so it was a very old house. And later on, we found out a little bit more about the architecture of the house. So apparently this small brown house that was right next door was at one time a butcher shop. And I'm talking like back in the 1800s, late 1800s, late to mid 1800s. The house that I lived in was actually a barn. What they did is they just basically built a front gable on it and a front porch, but it was basically a straight cut. It was a barn, and then they built a little bit onto the back and to the kitchen section. And there were additions to it, but it was a barn. I realized that when I was a teenager and I was up there working on the roof, and yeah, it was slats thrown together, 32-inch boards and 4x4s and just whatever they could put up. So apparently, yeah, it was a barn at one time. And when we were doing some digging underneath the house one time, we had some foundation issues. We found a lot of old like cow bones and animal bones, stuff like that. No, I know that in itself isn't creepy. I'm just trying to, basically explain. We had a big oak tree in the front yard that was, older than the city of Cleveland. This tree, we counted some of the rings on it, and it was over 350 years old. Great, big old massive thing. We had to trim it quite a few times because the branches were literally, overhanging people's houses and falling. It was a nightmare, but it was cool. I always liked that tree. Lots of, roses. We had a Japanese red maple trees. We had a pretty nice yard. I mean, we did the best with what we had. Limited resources. We weren't poor, but then again, we definitely weren't, upper middle class range, or we would have moved out of that neighborhood a long time ago. My parents, staunch Democrats, and regardless of the white flight and the degenerating neighborhoods and crime conditions, they chose to stay, in which they, both ended up passing away in the house. Well, my father passed away in hospice care in 2010, but my mom did pass away a year later in the house. But yeah, so I mean, they stuck it out. They were troopers. Anyway, I don't want to get too much into my family history. I just kind of wanted to frame that and let you know what kind of house this was. Now, also, my father, when he first got into the house, decided to renovate and do some work. And he found a large crease in one of the walls in the bathroom. And he pushed on the side of the crease and found out it was actually like sort of a hidden passageway. It was weird. It was a staircase that led from there to this room. We called it an attic. It wasn't technically an attic. It was actually a kind of a rec room, but I don't know why we always called it the attic, just because, that's where we played darts, and my parents had a nice bar set up in there. It was a recreational room. Also, the absolute creepiest fucking room in the house that I didn't go into unless somebody else was with me, but yeah, it was weird. But anyway, there was literally a staircase that led from the downstairs bathroom up to the attic. And it had been closed off. It had been kind of sealed, but my father and he found it. When he went inside there, he only found one thing inside that staircase. Well, a couple things, but some sort of bird feathers, candles, and an old newspaper. And he actually kept the old newspaper. I don't have it anymore, but I don't know if one of my siblings has it or what. But the headline on the front of the paper was "The Cleveland Torso Murderer Strikes Again." Now, I don't know if any of you know about the history of Cleveland or the Cleveland Torso Murderer, but there was, back in, I believe it was the 1930s, early 40s, there were several people who were literally cut apart and floating down the river. They found bodies everywhere, and it was an unsolved crime. They never solved it. As a matter of fact, Elliot Ness at the time was a safety director in Cleveland, and because of the fact that he couldn't solve that, and then he got drunk and ran over an 11-year-old boy, that was pretty much the end of his career. Elliot Ness actually ended up poor, destitute, and addicted to painkillers and alcohol. He ended up dying like literally a poor man in the city of Cleveland. Just in case any of you guys are curious about what happened to Mr. Untouchable. Yeah, he actually killed a 11-year-old boy in a drunk driving accident too. Go figure. Anyway, so I'm not saying that someone who lived in my house was a Cleveland Torso murderer. I'm not saying that they weren't. I don't know. I don't have any proof. And, we're talking the early 80s when, they discovered this. So it's not like you could just hop online and research it and find out who all lived in that house. I mean, one of these days I'm going to do an exhaustive search and find out a little bit more about the history of the place if I can. And, I'll keep you updated. But just a little something interesting. So the house was always a little bit weird. The first ghost that I ever saw was it was weird. I would go to bed at night, and I always kept my door open because I was afraid of the dark. Because, like I said, I would hear scratching at the walls. I would hear whispers, people talking, just very strange shit. And I didn't know if it was a TV. I didn't know if it was one of the animals in the house. I didn't know what it was, but it was always weird. It was always hard to go to sleep. So I'd keep the door open and the hallway light on, and there was an old lady that just would basically walk across the hallway, and she would stop at each door. She wasn't scary. She wasn't creepy looking, anything like that. It was actually a reassuring thing. Actually, when I was a little kid, I actually thought that this old lady was some sort of family member or friend who just would come by to check on us. And she would just walk and look there, and then she'd walk towards that rec room that I told you about that we called the attic. She'd walk towards there and just vanish. I'd go looking around and see if she was in the other room. She was never anywhere around. And so one day I told my father about this, and my father was a skeptic, and he said, "This is an old house. Yeah, people have died in here. The only one who's died in here recently was Miss Johnston before we moved in the house." And I'm like, "Miss Johnston?" "Yeah, the Johnstons, the people who sold us the house. Their mother lived upstairs in that one bedroom, and after she passed away, they sold the house." So, you kind of put two and two together. There's my old lady who came and checked on us, my spectral grandma, so to speak. Like I said, she was nothing scary. I won't go into big detail about this because a lot of this happened when I was really young, and I don't remember it all too well in the details, but I would have a reoccurring dream. And in the reoccurring dream, either the attic door, once I said the rec room, the creepy room, the door would open and out would walk this man, and he would just kind of stand there in my doorway. And he was a tall guy, very dapper dressed. That's the only way I could put it. Definitely, not of the 1980s style or even 70s or 60s. It was definitely very old. He had on a black hat. He had on a kind of salt and pepper hair underneath it. Like, sort of like if you could imagine a younger version of the tall man from the Phantasm. That's kind of what I always thought about. That's why the Phantasm scared the shit out of me when I was a kid. But I would have the dream that he would show up, and I didn't like the guy at all. Usually, in the dream, he would just show up and stare at me in the door, or he would pound on the wall beside my bed, or something. But but in a lot of the dreams, I would wake up. This was in the dream. I would wake up in the dream alone in my room, and there was always a pile of covers over there in the corner, and I would, all of a sudden it would look like something was there, and then I would see a face literally pressing up out of the bed, and then it would drop away, and it was the dapper guy, the fancy man, as I like to call him. And I'd freak out, and I'd go try to find my sister. My sister Stacy was about 4 years older than me, so I would go run and I'd look for her, and she wasn't upstairs. And this happened several times. And then I would run down the steps, and at the time we had a desk that an old family down the street gave us when their mom passed away. As a matter of fact, it's the same desk that I'm on right now. I can't really show you because it's kind of messy right now, but yeah, it's the same desk, one of the few pieces of furniture I actually kept from the house. But my sister would literally be curled up in a ball underneath the desk, and I would ask her, "Hey, what's wrong?" She said, "I had the dream again about the man, the fancy man, and his face came out of the blankets." Well, so, it was a dream, like I said. I mean, I would hear noises and stuff like that. I never physically saw them manifest while I was awake. But the fact that me and my sister both had the exact same dream about the exact same person and the exact same occurrence over and over and over again when we were growing up kind of should, enlighten you to the fact that there was some not right shit going on. Paranormal, whatever you want to call it. I don't know. But anyway, so this was the house that I lived in. So I just wanted to, kind of describe to you and let you understand, old hardwood. I mean, if you went behind, there was a couple holes in the walls, and if you went behind there were still the fixtures for gas lighting and stuff like that. The house was built in 1892 was what the deed on it said. But before that, it was a barn, so it was literally converted from a barn structure to a home in 1892. So who knows what kind of history went on there? I never got a chance to learn. So maybe one of these days, if I really dig and have the time, I'll look into it. But anyway, so this was the summer. I was 7 years old. This was between my first year of school and first grade and second grade, I believe, or I think it was between second and third. I was kind of a heavy set, awkward kid. We didn't have a lot of money. I didn't have the fanciest clothes around. Most of the stuff that I wore at that time was stuff that my grandmother would get us from rummage sales or yard sales, or if I was real lucky, my dad would take me over to this Kmart or Zayres and buy me one pair of paper thin jeans, and that would have to last. So yeah, it wasn't exactly a fashion play. We were kind of, the poor kids. My dad drove a Triumph motorcycle, so people just kind of, gave us the white trash tag. So I always felt a little ostracized as a kid, and I never really hung out with, a few of the other kids occasionally, but not, I never had any really, really good friends that early in life. Then one day I'm standing out there, and here comes this kid walking down the street, blonde hair like mine, blue eyes like mine, hair parted on the side, and the old Hitler basic white boy look that, my dad insisted that I have back then. And he was throwing around a football, and we started talking. We started hanging around. His name was Henry. And yeah, me and Henry got to be good friends over the summer. I literally, didn't even try to hang out or talk to anybody else or even my friends or my family because Henry was always there every day. I would literally, I slept in a back room in the house, so literally on the second floor, and my room was facing the backyards, and there was 3 yards over, and that was where Henry told me that he lived, in this big house that had 2 or maybe 3 units in it. I'm not sure, but literally I would wake up in the morning and I would look out of my window and there would be Henry. Henry always wore the same clothes, but I just assumed Henry was poor. I never really questioned his clothing style or anything like that. Henry had this old beat up looking football that he always held and kind of flipped around in his hand, and he wore what we would have called floods back in the 1980s, these like real short kind of weird pleated jeans and a flannel shirt. And I wore a flannel shirt most of the time too, so grunge before its time. But anyway, yeah, and Henry was kind of a little bit of a troublemaker too. Like Henry told me one time, he's like, "Hey man, you want to see something cool?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure, what?" And he tells me to go in my house, and he never went in my house, so I don't really know how he knew, but he's like, "Your mom's got them kitchen matches in the kitchen, right? The like little blue tip matches." And he's like, "Yeah, let's try something." So he's sitting there just instructing me, and like a idiot, I'm doing exactly what Henry's telling me to do. So I took these blue tip matches and I'm pounding them down, making powder out of them. And there was this large cement pillar, and it had holes in it, like machined holes through it, I guess, from where they, had to move it. And it was between my driveway and the people next door, the ones who lived in the old, butcher shop. And I would take the powder and fill that little hole inside of it up, and then take a piece of paper and light the paper and stick it in the hole, and flames would shoot out both sides. And this was fucking fascinating. I'm me and Henry are sitting out there having a great time, blowing shit up until the neighbor came out. "Oh, what the hell are you doing?" And I got a whooping. And I want to make a point. Yes, my parents were disciplinarians. I did get my ass whipped, but I don't feel that I was an abused child. I was never sexually abused. I was never brutally physically abused. There wasn't a whole lot of problems going on in my house. I was a church-going kid. I didn't get into any sort of drugs or anything at this time. So I just want to specify that before people start trying to, psychoanalyze this situation. But, yeah, and then, okay, and another time, here's an example. My mom was heavy into politics at the time, so she had a whole bunch of these cardboard political signs for somebody who she was endorsing. And the election was over, so we just had these signs piled up in our attic. And I asked my mom, I'm like, "Hey, Mom, can I take those and, build like a house?" 'Cause I played with the little 6-inch G.I. Joe, so I wanted to build a house for him. So I'm sitting there, cutting cardboard and making this, several story structure in my front yard. And here comes Henry, and he's looking at it. He's like, "That's cool, but you know what would be really cool?" And I'm like, "What?" He's like, "Yeah, let's play war, like real war." And I'm like, "Well, what do you mean, like real war? What is real war?" So at the time, I had one of the old G.I. Joe jets, and it fit one of the action figures in. It was probably about a foot foot and a half long. But anyway, I had that, and I had the TIE fighter from Star Wars. So what he did is he found an old pen. Like, we found a couple old pens that didn't write, and he took the pen and lit the end of it on fire, so it like literally dripped down these big flaming balls that were like, dive bombing. So we stuck them on the bottom of the toy planes, and we, had all these buildings that I'd made out of the cardboard, and boom, they were dropping them on there, and there's fires going off everywhere, and good times. Until Mom came out and started whipping my ass, and Henry disappeared, around the corner in a flash, literally, and so yeah, and I never said anything. I didn't throw Henry under the table and say it was his idea, because I did most of the construction and destruction myself anyway. He just gave me the idea. So then, one time I'm sitting at the table with my sister, and this was an interesting story, and sorry, Stacy, if you watch this, but I have to share this. My mom asked me what I wanted to be. I said I wanted to be a rock star. And she asked my sister what she wanted to be, and she said she wanted to be a squirrel when she grew up. And, being the smart ass, unfiltered fucker that I was, even at 7 years old, I'm like, that's pretty stupid. I said, well, I'm stupid, but at least I'm not crazy like you. And I'm like, fuck do you mean I'm crazy? I'm like, I'm not crazy. You're the one who wants to be a squirrel. How the hell am I crazy? Then she looks over at me and she says, everybody around has been talking. The neighbors have been talking. You've been running around for the past few weeks in the yard talking to yourself all the time. And I'm like, no, I haven't. That's not true. I'm hanging out with my friend Henry. She's like, who's Henry? I don't know Henry. I've never met Henry. And I'm like, well, you're never out there when he's there. And I'm like, well, who else knows Henry besides you? And I'm like, I started thinking, well, nobody. She's like, well, where does Henry live? So I told her, I'm like, Henry lives, 3 doors down in Rubel's house. Now, Rubel was an old hillbilly, probably at that time in his 50s, maybe early 60s. And right next door to him, there was the old lady who actually owned the building. Her name was Roanne. She had a little candy store down on Clark Avenue, where they sold little, 5 and dime candy and stuff like that. And Rubel kind of, by the time I was a little kid, Roanne was really old, so Rubel was kind of taking over the property management and that type of thing. And later on that day, I saw Henry, and I'm like, where do you live? He's like, I live over there in the basement. There's an apartment down there. And I'm like, okay. So I thought about it, and then my sister started picking at me about it again, telling me I got an imaginary friend. And I'm like, no, he's not an imaginary friend. His name's Henry. We hang out. I mean, I'm not, crazy. So I go over there, and I knock it on the back door, which I assumed was a staircase down to the steps. And here comes Rubel, old crazy, mean, mad Rubel, comes out and looks at me and says to me, he's like, the hell are you pounding on my door for, boy? And I tell him, I'm here to check on Henry. And literally, this guy's face turned sheet white. He looked about 100 years older than he actually was. And I'm like, he told me he lives down here in the basement. And he got just incensed. Suddenly he turned red in the face. He got angry. He grabbed a shovel off his porch and literally chased me out of the yard with it and told me, that's not funny. I don't know who the hell put you up to that, but that's not funny. Don't ever come back here again, and don't pound on my basement door. So I was very confused, very upset, walking around. The next day I walked around, looked for Henry, and finally I seen Roanne, the old lady, the one who owned the house that Rubel was in and that Henry told me he lived in. So I asked her, I'm like, is there a little boy, kind of looks like me, about my height, blonde hair, wears old-fashioned type of pants, flannel shirt all the time, who lives in the basement over here. And she got a sad look on her face, and then she smiled at me and she said, well, he don't live there no more, honey. He's been gone for a long, long time. And I'm like, what do you mean? And I guess apparently back, I couldn't exactly put a date on it, but I guess back when Rubel was young and lived across the street, Henry lived in that apartment that he was in, and Henry was literally his best friend. Rubel was in his, like I said, 50s, 60s at the time, so if he was friends with an 8-year-old kid when he was 8 years old, we're talking about 40-something years in the past. And Henry apparently, well, he lived in the house, played with matches in the basement, and he started a fire, and Henry had passed away in that house. So, that was the first time in my life I realized that, yeah, there's a ghost. And I wasn't a very great kid at the time. I actually, because, so many people had heard me talking about my friend Henry, that I kind of turned Henry into an entity, sort of a alternate personality. I'd leave the house and I'd have a couple different shirts on, one underneath and one above, and I'd change to the Superman. I changed the part of my hair from one side to the other one. And when I did the bad shit, I tell people I was Henry. When I did the good shit, I would tell people that I was Jay. So, and this actually went on for quite a while. And I would have people walk up to me when I was in my Jay persona and tell me, "You're a good kid, but that Henry, he's going to be in trouble." And I'm like, "Oh, don't worry. I will tell my mom about it. He'll get a whooping. It'll be taken care of." And I kept this going for quite a while. So I was getting away with literally, whatever I wanted, because I was blaming people. Actually thought I was a twin. And, eventually one of the neighbors got mad and decided to come over the house and told my mom. She's like, "Well, that Jay, he's a good boy, but that little Henry, he's a little bastard." And my mom looked at her and says, "Who?" "Henry." And, so at that point the gig was up. My mom figured out what I was doing, and, I got a nice whooping with one of those big orange flexi Hot Wheel tracks that day that I didn't quite forget for a long time. So that was the end of Henry. I never saw Henry around again until I was about 18 or 19 years old. I was up working on my parents' roof one day, just doing some tear off. I had helpers, but that day, I think my nephew was helping me, but he was in the house, and I'm up on top of the roof, so I had the big view of all the backyards, and I just happened to glance over there, thinking about, my buddy Henry from that summer long ago, and there he was, just standing there in the yard, and he kind of waved. Yes, that was sort of his goodbye. I never saw Henry after that, but that's when I realized that, yeah, there's something to this paranormal shit. There's something to this world beyond the veil that we know. And I wasn't going to bring this story up, but my friend Jay, who was, he lived in a few apartments with me, back when I first was young and first moved out of my parents' house, and he was my roommate a couple different times, including in the weird bar that I talked about in my previous video, which this place was weird. I mean, there was times when I'd go to sleep having to get up for work the next day, and I'd hear my friends out there talking, and I would be like, "What the fuck? Don't they ever get quiet?" So I'd pull my door open and get ready to yell at everybody, and crickets. There was literally nobody awake, no lights on, nothing. But yeah, it sounded like, like the bar was still going on. So this place was really strange. And one night, we were on copious amounts of drugs, which, is going to pretty much probably cast off exactly what I'm going to tell you happened that night, but just suspend disbelief and let me finish the story before you tune out. But anyway, we were doing this, and like I said, it was an old creepy bar that was turned into a house or an apartment with a couple bedrooms built on, but it also had a full-sized basement in it, like literally with an old freezer in it and all kinds of storage rooms and stuff, because it was a commercial business before it was an apartment. So my roommate had a couple friends over from work, and they were both really high. This girl Laura and her roommate, I can't remember what his name is, but they were giggling like schoolgirls and kind of getting on Jay's nerves. And Jay's like, you know what? I feel good. I'm gonna go down in the basement for a little while. I'm like, why would you want to go down in that dirty ass creepy basement? He's like, I don't know, I just want to. And he disappeared. And like literally an hour later, I remember looking over at Laura and asking her, I'm like, where is Jay? Then probably about 10 minutes after that, Jay finally walks up the stairs and comes in there. He's still got a big goofy smile, but that probably had something to do with the, they call it Molly now, the MDMA. We were on ecstasy and magic mushroom. So, you couldn't not be happy given these circumstances. And I was like, what's going on, man? What are you so happy about? And he's like, dude, go sit down in there in the basement in the back room in a chair. Just do it. Don't say anything. Just do it, man. Keep all the lights off. And I'm like, why would I want to sit down in the dirt? He's like, dude, just do it. You have to do this. So I'm like, all right, no big deal. So as per Jay's instructions, I went down there and I sat in a chair in that back room, and it's nice and relaxing, Of course, I'm seeing little flashes of things here and little flashes of things there, and because of the drugs that I was on. But suddenly, what looked like a big purple fucking light started off real small and then grew bigger. And out of this light steps this old Indian. And he's looking at me, and I'm like, hey, how you doing? And he's like, oh, I'm doing good. You're the one who's not doing good. And I'm like, well, what are you talking about? And he said, well, you're destroying your brain. You're destroying your soul. You are fucking yourself up with these drugs. What is the matter with you? Do you want to destroy yourself? Do you want to die? And I'm like, no, I don't want to die. I want to live. I'm young. I'm having a good time. And he's like, well, you gotta quit. You gotta quit doing these drugs. And and the whole time I'm sort of, he's real serious while he's talking to me, and I'm like thinking to myself, and I'm like, the fucking irony of the fact that a drug-induced hallucination is giving me an anti-drug speech, I thought was really fucking crazy. So I'm laughing, and yeah, I talked to him. I don't remember the whole conversation, but I go upstairs and I'm smiling and happy, and I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I do need to slow down. Unfortunately, if you watch my last video, that happened a couple months later, so I didn't really heed his warning like I should have. But I go and I sit down, and I'm smiling and thinking about what the Indian in the basement told me. And here's the weird part. Okay, hallucination, drugs, right. My roommate Jason looks over at me and he smiles and he said, dude, did you talk to the Indian in the basement? So, he wanted me to bring that one up. So, here's out to my buddy Jay, my brother Jay Smith Heisler. Thanks for bringing that up. That's a good story that I can share. Of course, people are going to say it's all drug-induced, but how the fuck we both had the same hallucination at the same time is beyond me. But, hey, you never know. But, those are a couple of the stories that I wanted to share with you. The tale of Henry and the Indian in the basement and the tall man. And I've had other supernatural experiences. Not a lot that I could tie together and provide proof for, or that have a conclusion. I would see something weird one time and it would go away. So, I could write books on it, but, I kind of like to wrap it up and do that. And if I could think of anything else, that I might want to get into later on, considering that it is Halloween. And if any of you have any ghost stories that you want to share in the comments, or if you have something that you think is real mind-blowing and awesome and you want to talk about it, just send me an email or write me a message, and we'll hook up Skype on here and we'll get you on here and we'll talk about it together. I'd love to have other people on my show and talk about these kind of things. But so this is the time of year when the veil is thin. The ancient Druids celebrated a holiday called Samhain, where they honored their ancestors, and in honoring their ancestors, the ancestors would help them with growth of things. All the stuff about demons and human sacrifice is all horseshit. One thing that you got to remember about the Druidic Society is the only written things or written history we have about it are what the Romans wrote, and the Romans conquered the Druids. So you do with that what you will. There's the story of the Wicker Man, which the Wicker Man was a legitimate thing. Now, those who study the Druidic traditions and talk about the Wicker Man and study Samhain say that what the Wicker Man was there were criminals, and instead of housing and feeding the criminals like we do in our more civilized humanitarian society, they would stuff them inside this big giant Wicker Man and burn them alive. That was their sacrifice. It wasn't like they sacrificed virgins or cut the hearts out of babies or young girls or anything like that. They killed criminals. Not saying that that's any better or more humane, but in case anybody's wondering what the Wicker Man's about, instead of watching that ridiculous fucking movie with Nicolas Cage. Not the bees! Not the bees! Just wanted to clarify that with you. So but it was also said that this was the time of year where the veil was the thinnest between the living and the dead, where you can literally communicate with that. And in the early Christian era, they changed the name to All Hallows Eve, and the kids would literally dress up in scary masks as ghouls or ghosts or whatever, so that they would scare away the ghosts and the undead and the demons and everything else that were supposedly able to come through. And that's how the history of Halloween started. But I'm not going to go into that. There's a lot of people who are much more eloquent and articulate and can tell you, a lot better the history of Halloween than I can. But I just want you to know that, believe or don't believe, there's certain people out there who just have that about them. Maybe it's something to do with the pineal gland, your third eye. Some people's are more calcified than others or less calcified than others, and they can see into these things and where other people can't. Or as you get older and you become an adult, your mind rationalizes it and you put it off and say that it isn't real. Like my father, I'm going to come back to this example. How I told you my father said it was all hogwash and he didn't believe in any of it. Well, my father was diagnosed with lung cancer in 2009, and by the time we found out, it was stage 4 or stage 3D, which means it had metastasized and spread to his heart and brain and everything else. So there was, and he hung on for quite a long time after that. But and then he always made sure that he was clear of mind. I mean, literally, I would come over after I got off work, and I would take care of him and, take him to the bathroom or do whatever he needed to do. And he would always tell me, today's date this is January 31st, 2000. So he would know that his mind was still there. And, it went eventually, obviously, as it does. But, during the summer, we had a lot of talks and a lot of things. And one time I got up and I went to the bathroom, and my dad was sitting there in his, he had a hospital bed, like a hospice set up. And I come out and he's standing up, and I'm like, Dad, you're going to fall down. What's going on? And he's like, who the hell was that at the door? And I'm like, Dad, there's nobody at the door. He's like, he's standing right there staring at me. And I look out the door, I don't see anything. And I'm like, Dad, there's nobody there. And Dad just kind of shook his head, and he laid down, and he's like, damn it, they're back. And I'm like, what do you mean they're back, Pops? What are you talking about? And he said, I'm seeing them again. And I'm like, well, you always told me that they weren't real. And he said, I told you that so you wouldn't be scared. I saw them when I was a kid, and I learned how to block them out, and we had a long talk about it. He believed all the time, but it was something that literally scared the hell out of him. So he just, tried to convince me that it wasn't real. Just food for thought. Even those people who are the staunchest non-believers might just be a little bit afraid to admit that it's real, or that there's something to it. I don't believe that you're going to catch them on recording devices. I don't believe in all the ghost hunter horse shit. As a matter of fact, I met some of the ghost hunters back in Cleveland, and nice people, great interest. They do their homework and their research, but I really don't think any of those shows are ever going to amount to anything. It's either you have that part of you where you see these things, or you don't. Either you can see beyond the veil, or you don't. And that's just pretty much all that there is to it. So I'm going to leave you off with that, but I want to just leave you off with a thought. The weather's getting cold. It's getting breezy. The holidays are coming up. A lot of us feel tired and sad and alone, and we miss the people that are gone from us. But I want you to think about something. When you feel that finger run through your hair, or you feel that cold breeze in the house, or feel that tickle in your spine, just remember, you, my friend, are never alone. Thank you. Happy Samhain. Love you all. Bye.